My name is Julia Wester. I'm a co-founder of a company called 55 Degrees. Not from here. I am not even from where I live now. I live in southern Sweden in Malmö, across from Copenhagen. But I'm from the US. And I'm here to talk to you today about how we transform our forecasts using probabilities, how people can understand what the odds are of a situation happening. I mean, if you think about it, when you give people a forecast, do you even know what the chances are you're going to make that forecast? Do you know how to tell them what that is? So that's what we're going to talk about today. And to give you some tools, not actually tools that you have to pay for, but give you you can, that's fine. They exist. I even have one. But everything that I'm going to talk to you about today, you can do with a little bit of data, pencil and paper, and, if you want to use Excel and stuff, you can, if you want to do it the hard way. So you can get value out of this no matter what your budget or your tool sets are. So that's really important to me when we talk about stuff like this, that everyone can sort of get utility from that. So Benjamin Franklin, big guy in my world, he said a long, long time ago that nothing in this world is certain except death and taxes. And I can tell you as an American citizen, taxes follow me everywhere. I cannot get away from them. We're one of the only countries that get worldwide taxes. So in my situation specifically. And when you think about things that happen in our workplace and think for a second of, are there many, many things that are absolutely certain in the way you work and in your workplace? Because I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. Now, when we give people forecasts and we tell them, hey, this is going to finish by this date, we don't often tell them any information about how likely that forecast is to happen. For instance, if you use, this particular picture, which is a Gantt chart, and nothing against Gantt charts, but in this particular view, I see nothing here about, am I certain that these things are going to happen this way? If I'm not, how confident am I in that particular outcome? So when we look at a forecast, and if you're not familiar with a Gantt chart, each one of these is a different thing that's going to be delivered. And the length of the bar is supposed to show when we're going to start and when we're going to finish, right? But each one of these lines is one possibility out of many, right? And we put all of these one possibilities together. We decide, hey, I'm going to go with this one. That feels sort of good. Don't know exactly how good, but it'll probably be okay. And then we put it on this, big chart, and then other things sort of take that for granted and they get planned around that. And we end up sort of building this very fragile house of cards. So if one piece falls down, all the rest sort of crumple and fall together. Now, we have to think about if someone were to tell me something that I really wanted to happen and they didn't tell me how confident they were in that, I'm going to fill in the blanks. So if you tell me, hey, you're going to have this by tomorrow, I'm thinking, awesome, I will definitely, absolutely, 100% sure have this thing tomorrow, because they don't tell me of all the possible outcomes that could happen. Now, I was thinking earlier about this. I don't know why I thought about such a morbid thing, but when I was thinking about what's like one of the worst things that you could do with thinking you have certainty with a forecast and then not actually having the certainty that you thought, for some weird reason, I thought about, this guy, goes to the doctor and they say, you have 3 months to live, right? Sucks, right? But, there's no talk of odds or anything like that. And so he's like, well, that sucks, but I'm going to take my savings and I'm just going to go blow it all because, what do I have to lose, right? And so lo and behold, the best thing in the world happens and he doesn't die in 3 months. Maybe he even recovers. Now he's broke. And, what's he going to do, right? And the thing is that we make decisions and we make plans around the forecast that we give. And while not everything is as critical as that particular situation, especially at work, not everything is life and death, we do have to understand what's happening around us and what people do with the information that we give them. So it's really important that we give them as much as we can know about things like forecasts. Like I said, I work for a company called 55 Degrees. Dan and I work together on actionable agile and other things. And so I talk to customers about forecasts quite a lot. Here's just a bunch of ways that you can get in contact with us, and we'll see this again at the end. Now, I want to talk a little bit about certainty and why we can't really have it at work before I go into how we actually know what the chances are of something happening. Because even when you tell people, we can't really be certain, when it comes to forecasts, they still really just want to know exactly when it's going to be done, or the worst case scenario, and they want you to sort of stick by it. But on the other hand, we all are, liking this thing called Agile, right? And in Agile is the underlying concept that we can know everything up front. That's not really what it's all about, right? So we want certain forecasts, but yet we also understand that we can't work in a way that will let us think that we can know everything we need to know up front. And so those two things don't really blend together. So Stephen Bungay has this book, The Art of Action. And he has something he calls the 3 gaps. And it was funny because I think people who go to these conferences a lot, they have like a conference bingo. And so if you have one of those cards, I mentioned Stephen Bungay, so you can mark it on your bingo card, sort of like Cynefin or wordly mapping or something like that. So anyway, the 3 gaps he talks about are really gaps that get in the way of allowing us to make a foolproof plan and to have absolute certainty, those things that which we need to provide a certain forecast. Okay, so I want to get into the little cognitive dissonance there between what we want and what we can actually have. So we have the first thing, we have this idea that, hey, there's outcomes we want. We're going to make a great plan. We're going to act on that plan, and then hopefully we'll land right back at the outcomes we wanted. But the first gap gets in our way. We don't get too far before we realize we can hit the knowledge gap. This is what Agile knows. This is why Agile exists. There's a difference between what we know and what we want to know, or even what we can know at the moment. If you've ever heard, I know what I don't know. I don't know what I don't know, those kinds of things. There's many, many things that we don't even know what we don't know right now. So we couldn't make a perfect plan if we tried. But let's imagine that we could take a magic wand and just build a bridge right over that knowledge gap, right? And make a perfect plan. Then we can fall into the alignment gap. And this is the difference between what we want people to do and what they actually do. So if you've ever seen that picture of this product requirements picture of where you have a tire swing or something, and it's like, this is the way I wrote the requirements, this is what the developer saw, this is what the QA tester saw, right? You can have the most detailed spec doc in the world, give it to 5 people, and get 5 different understandings of what that spec doc had, right? So everyone has their own CPU inside their brain, and their programming is different. So let's assume that I could know enough about everyone to program them to do exactly what I want to do. So I've got this magic bridge, I've got this programmer that I can, magically program everyone. I can still fall into the effects gap. And that happens between our actions and outcomes. Yeah, this is the good picture spot. So essentially, has anyone here ever done an action more than once and gotten a different outcome? I see at least a couple of hands, right? So you fell into the effects gap, right? We live and work in complex systems. We can't always control everything that will impact the outcome a certain action has, right? We just can't. We don't have the scope of all of that. So unless you can control every single thing that impacts your actions turning into the outcomes you want, you cannot make a perfect enough plan to have absolute certainty. So I'm going to assume that you're all on board with the fact now that we can't really ever make a foolproof plan so that we know 100% for sure that when I make this plan, I can get exactly what I want and exactly when I want it. So now, even when we know that, we still have a backward slide sometimes. So a lot of times, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but let's say you had a project and you wrote this spec doc, right? And it didn't quite go the way you want. So the next time, what do? You build, you write a spec doc that's twice as long, or you have a plan that, goes way, way down into the details because we just didn't do it hard enough. So let's do it more and see if that gets us the result that we want, right? And we know that that's not the right choice, but we don't know what else to do. right? We feel like we have to give this certainty, and we're just not doing things that make a lot of sense. And by the way, this is the workplace version of doing it harder, like the Gantt chart didn't work. So now we're going to spend all this time, which earlier today we heard that's our most valuable resource. So yeah, let's take all of this extra time and go into these stories and see if we can decompose it into all the little bits and pieces that we can get estimates for, how long they take. But we forgot the effects gap. Even if we could do that right, we still can't control everything that will impact how long doing all those things will take, because we don't do all of that in a vacuum. So all of that to say is that we've been living in the world of deterministic forecasts. We want to say, with apparent absolute certainty that this thing will be done on this date or by that date. That is really only appropriate, and I think that's a good word, appropriate, if there can only ever be one possible outcome, because that's all it communicates. This is your certainty type of forecast. No understanding of the odds. What we want to move to instead is something called a probabilistic forecast, right? That's when we start to figure out ways to explore, okay, we can't be certain about what exactly is going to happen. We know there are multiple possibilities. So this is appropriate whenever we have uncertainty, but we need to figure out a way to explore what those are and understand which are more likely and learn how to give forecasts in that way. So what's cool is you have dealt with probabilistic forecasts your whole life. You may not even know it, right? Like the weather forecast, if they say, there's a 50% chance of rain between 12 and 1. Well, that's a probabilistic forecast because every one of these has two components. It has a probability, that's in the name, so it's sort of a freebie, right? So an 85% chance or a 50% chance or 10%, whatever, that's the likelihood. That's how certain you are that what you're about to tell them will come true, right? But then the second part is a range of outcomes because, even though we're giving a risk, an understanding of the probability, we're still not doubling down and saying there's an 85% chance of this exact outcome happening. Usually it's a range of outcomes. So I am this certain that what happens will fall into this range of possible outcomes. So when we're talking about forecasting, what that means is something like this. There's an 85% chance that this item will be done on or before this date, or have a 70% confidence that we'll finish this many or more items in a given period of time. This is the kind of language we want to start training people to listen for and understand. And if they get a forecast and it doesn't have any odds in it, right, maybe they'll start to learn to ask you, well, how certain are you with that? Because this lets us tell some risk. There's a risk not only in the percentile, like if I'm 85% certain, that means I'm 15% certain it might not happen. That's the level of risk. Are you okay with those odds, right? Are you okay with a 15% chance of falling on essentially what the downside of your bet is, right? Is that good enough? And we'll talk about the ranges in a moment, but there's risk in the range as well. If I tell you there's an 85% chance of something happening between 2 and 4 days, that's different from me saying between 2 and 60 days, right? So I'm showing you risk in a couple of different very important ways. Now, in the rest of this talk, we're going to be going through the simple way to create these probabilistic forecasts, and you'll be surprised probably, if you don't already know, that you really don't need a lot of data to do these, right? So we're going to create a single item forecast. That's, how long will it take for this one piece of work to be done? And then we're going to look at multiple item forecasts, and that sort of comes in two flavors. I like to call it sort of fixed date and fixed scope because that's language that we're all familiar with. So fixed date is I have to get something done by this day. I used to work on the NBA.com website in the US, so that's the National Basketball Association, the National Basketball League. And we worked on the website. So I couldn't say, hey, I don't think we're going to be ready by that date, so we'll have to push the draft, until a bit later. There are just some things that you have to do by a certain date, and you have to figure out how much can you get done. And then there's the fixed scope. Like this just cannot go out without this core set of functionality, it won't be worth it. So when can we deliver that? So those are the two types of multi-item forecasts that we're going to go over. The really cool thing is that the data that you need to do all of this, you could capture on physical boards by writing on your sticky notes. All you really need to know about a work item is when they start and when they finish. And if you collect that for enough work items over time, you can make all three of those types of forecasts. So it's really, really simple. You can get more data and do more complex stuff for sure, but the basic forecasting, this is all you need. So let's jump into single item forecasts. So essentially, again, I'm asking, how long will it take to get something from start to finish? Okay, so start and finish, that's a thing that you bring to the table. You decide what start means and what finish means. But the measure of how long something will take is called cycle time. Okay, you will hear other words, but for me, I use this to mean from any start point to any finish point. And my definition of that is the total elapsed time it takes from a work to travel between those 2 points. Okay, so really the calculation here, and I'm using date as a day as my granularity, but you can insert something more granular if you want, or something less granular, but the formula stays the same. So it's finish date minus start date plus 1. And we add the plus 1, just so you know why, is to make sure that we include both the start date and the end date. So it's just simple subtraction. Okay, so the way that we look at cycle time in aggregate and really understand our system, because when we think about forecasting and making forecasts, if we don't know how likely it is that we'll deliver something in a certain time, the best way to find out is to do it over and over and over again, right? If you don't know the answer to any question, you try it out a lot of times and see what the spread of possibilities are, and you can sort of see what's likely to happen. And that's exactly what we do. But fortunately, unless you're a brand new team, you've already done this over and over and over again. You've delivered individual pieces of work, right? So I can look at this cycle time metric on a scatter plot. I can learn a lot from this, and I'm not going to go into all of what you can learn today, but I will explain how you can pretty easily get a forecast that's good enough for most of our needs based on data instead of, feelings or, it's not very time consuming to make. So just so we all understand what we're looking at, each dot on this chart is a work item that's been finished. So it's plotted on the horizontal axis for when it finished. So something finished on this date, that determines where it's plotted. And then on the vertical axis, it's how long it took to get done. So things that are plotted higher have a longer cycle time. Things that are plotted lower have a lower cycle time. Okay. Now, what we do here is, and I think you might have noticed you can't see that, but the percentile lines, right? So we have some lines that say 95%, 23 days, 85%, 16 days. There's no special super magic statistical math in there. Like, you can do this on your own, even if you had a piece of paper and you had a pen and you had your sticky notes with start and end dates. You could make this chart, and then you could figure out how likely it is that you finished work in a certain, amount of time or less. Because let's pretend there's 100 dots on this chart, and I wanted to find out the 50th percentile. All I would do is count up from the bottom and see where my 50th dot lane, whatever, where it is. And then I would draw a line straight across, because essentially 50% of the dots finished at this point or below, right? And so on this chart, that's 7 days. 50% of the dots, 50% of the work items in my data set finished in 7 days or less. Now, if I know the number of dots, I can figure out how many I need to count up to for all the other lines. So 85% of the dots in this data set finished in 16 days or less, right? And so on and so forth. Now, when we're thinking about giving a forecast, we have to think about, we can calculate any probability we want from 1 to, well, we'll talk about that in a second. But we have to decide which one we're going to use when we give forecasts to people. And the way that I suggest thinking about that is by looking at what your tolerance for being wrong, and I'm going to put that in quotes. What's the tolerance for you falling into the downside of your bet, right? So if I tell you, I'm going to deliver this, there's a 50% chance I'll give you this in a week, right? If you're a stakeholder, does that fill you with joy? Why not? Right, like I'm wrong as much as I'm right? So you really have no sense of how long I'm going to take to deliver that. So you can calculate that, but probably not useful for many people at all. Now, a lot of times, this is where people say, well, can we do 100, right? And then I have to remind them what we've already talked about at the beginning of this talk, right? And then when we talk about the data, I would essentially say, well, the data can only tell you things that have happened before. Something can happen that's never happened before. So maybe I could give you high 90s percentile, but let's not pretend that we can be certain when we've already figured out that we can't do that. And even if I did say that, I would be telling you, hey, there's a 95% chance we'll finish this anywhere between 0 and 45 days, right? I mean, that's not very useful either, right? So we have to have this balance of confidence and the range. Those two sort of need to be balanced. And not for nothing, if you need a high confidence and you're not happy with the range, you can fix that. But guess what? That's your situation right now. Like, that's how confident, that's the range you'll get for the confidence that you need. So that's your reality. Start using that and then start making it better with stuff that we're not talking about in this talk. That's a whole nother talk. Pay attention to aging, if that's your tip. Now, so just when you find the right balance, then you can start going with that, and you can deliver that kind of probabilistic forecast. So 85% of the time, if things go like they have before, we finish a work item in 16 days or less from when we start it, because remember, we're measuring from start to finish. Now, there's this underlying rule of thumb that I sort of glossed over, and that's like if things are like they were before, right? And yes, things can always be different. I like to think of it like this, is that it's very expensive to do forecasting that hasn't gotten us very much accuracy when we spend time trying to think about like all those work breakdown structures and everything. Our data set is much better suited at learning how to encompass all those extra factors that we just can't even think of how to incorporate into how they can impact our forecasts. Our data has already taken all of that into account. So when we think about the underlying rule of thumb, I think the best way to think about it is, here's what we've been able to do so far. Unless we do something differently, why should that change, right? Now, if you have made significant changes to your team, because there's a lot of factors that go into how long things take, right? So let's say your team massively changed, or the work you do has massively changed. Then, the data set is more just, you have to take it with a grain of salt. Use whatever forecasting method you want. It's going to be, none of it is going to be super reliable, but you can use it as a guide until you start generating new data with your new situation, and then you can pick right back up. So that's just something to keep in mind, that the data that you're using needs to have been generated in sort of roughly similar conditions as you'll have in the period you're trying to forecast. Now, when we look at multiple item forecasts, if you're doing sprint planning or release planning or making a project plan, there's lots of times we get asked for multiple item forecasts. We have to use a different metric for that, and that's the one that we call throughput. And it's a total count of items that pass the finish point. So at this point, when we're looking at data, all we really need is that finish line. We don't really care when it started, because we're looking at how many items can finish in our system, at what rate. So it's a rate metric. Now, there is a chart that you can make that shows you throughput, right? And basically, it can give you an idea of probabilities, but only about, what's the likelihood that you'll finish that number of items or a number of items in the single unit of time. Like, so if you're measuring throughput per day or throughput per week, you could use this to get an understanding of how likely it is you'll finish X in that day or in that week. But generally, when we're looking at forecasting multiple items, we're looking at multiple units of that time. So multiple days, multiple weeks, et cetera. So we have to lean on something called a Monte Carlo simulation. And you probably don't want to do those by hand, but Dan will tell you you can. He teaches that in classes. You can write all of this out. But there are lots of tools that do this for you. And essentially, it takes that throughput data. So you can see here, that's the exact same chart that we had. And if I'm trying to determine, hey, I've got this fixed scope of work, when can we get this done? Well, we need to tell that simulation a couple of things. We need to tell it, well, when are we going to start this work? And then how many items do we need to complete? How many items are in the scope that we know about? Because we're saying we have a fixed scope, right? So say today we have 45 items. So that's all I know. That's what I know today. So today I'm going to forecast when that's done. Tomorrow I could come back and update that number, et cetera. But what the Monte Carlo simulations do is they run thousands and thousands of trials. Because remember when I said, if you don't know what could happen, the best thing to do is to do it over and over and over again. Well, when we get to multiple items, that's sort of hard to do, and it sort of defeats the purpose. Because when you finish that multiple set, you're done. You don't need to do it again. You've got your answer. So we don't have time for all that, right? So the simulation does it for us. It says, okay, 10,000 trials, trial 1, day 1. Right? And then it goes and it says it randomly grabs a number from this chart. So one day it might grab 0. Day 2, it grabs 12. And it keeps going through days until it hits your 45. And then it says, okay, it took us this many days. And it does that 10,000 times. And we get to see all of those things and understand the likelihood of when they'll happen or how often they'll happen. There is a way that I took off the slide. Probably should have left it on because it's easy to see that distribution of outcomes, but I put the calendar on because when we're talking to people about forecasts, that's often the best way to talk to them about when things will be done. So this calendar really shows me information about the likelihood we'll finish those 45 items in a given period of time. So what I can do here is I can look and see that, hey, there's an 85% chance that we'll finish these 45 items on or before May 25th, right? And that just is what it is, right? I don't know if that's good, bad, and different. That's just based on what we've done so far. This is what we can expect, right? So if someone comes and says, oh, I really needed it to be done on the, 19th, right? We'll say, well, again, based on what we've been able to do so far, that's only 50% likely. So then you can have all your normal conversations about, is there anything we can do to improve those odds, right? And then I think we're talking a bit more about tactics and ways forward instead of saying, well, that's a crappy thing. I'm not happy with that. Go fix that. That's not acceptable. It's like, well, it's what we can do. So let's move forward and figure out what's possible. Now, the other kind of multi-item forecast, the fixed date, uses exactly the same type of simulation, but you have to feed it a slightly different information, right? So instead of telling it the number of items that we're going to finish, that's what we want it to tell us. So we give it a start date and an end date. So we tell it, what's the time frame we've got to work with, right? And then it does exactly the same thing. It runs 10,000 trials minimum usually, and then it goes, okay, day 1, trial 1, how many items can I get? And it does that for 10,000 times. And we see across those 10,000 trials, how many items did we finish in that time period, right? So it uses the shape of your data and all the variation in your data to look at all those impacts from the knowledge gap, the alignment gap, the effects gap that are really hard for us to model. And it blends it in, it's all accounted for, and then we get a better understanding of, based on what we've done before and what we faced, here's what we can accomplish. So I can look and see that, hey, there's an 85% chance that we can finish 67 or more items by then. So it's still a range because we're saying this many or more. We're giving people, the worst case scenario of that certainty, and then saying, or better, right? So what's really cool is that this one probably needs a little bit of a tool because it gets quite complex. But, so far we've been talking about individual buckets of work. So individual fixed scope, individual fixed date. But we know that we don't just have one thing going on at a time. So you can apply these same kinds of things to your portfolio and look at things like, based on the number of these multi-item efforts that we have going on, when are we likely to finish them based on how fast we finish the things that comprise them, right? How likely it is that we're going to finish by a given due date, et cetera. So I hope that it was clear that you need very, very little information about each work item to make these kinds of forecasts, that even though they sound very statistical, and when you start talking about percentages, some people's eyes glaze over and they're like, mathy, I'm not mathy, right? But I am like one of the least mathy people in the world, and I can understand enough to use this. Like, I don't know how to build a car, but I can drive my car effectively, right? It's the same kind of thing here. You do not need to be a statistician to use statistics and your data in your forecasting. Right. And so the key takeaways that I hope that you get is that we need to start working with ways that don't fight against the fact that we live in uncertainty. Right. When we move away from things that are made for certainty and move towards things that really thrive and are made for uncertainty, we're going to have a lot fewer conflicts and a lot more alignment on what we're actually talking about. So that means probabilistic forecast. And again, that shows risk in two different ways, a probability and a range. And when you think about which percentage to use, that's not something I can tell you. That's your context. You have to know the risk tolerance. You have to have the conversations about what happens if we're in the downside, right? And that'll really drive how high your confidence has to be. Just remember, the higher you go, the wider range you get, and you could unnecessarily overpad things, right? But in the long term, try to get to a point where your range is high and your probability is high and your range is low. So you can have the best of both worlds. Yeah. I wanted to also let you know that you really don't need a lot of data points to do some of this forecasting. I think when you look at the statistics, it generally says somewhere 7 to 11 data points is good enough to be statistically significant. In our tools, we have 10 data points is when we start turning on these features. So at minimum, you might only need 10 stories or items finished to do this kind of forecast. But the caveat there, because it's always like the consultant answer, right? Like, it depends is the answer to that question of how much data do I need? You have natural variation in your data, and Dan's going to be talking about this actually. So it's really cool that he's the next talk after the coffee break. The data set you need is minimum of, say, 10, as long as that 10 represents roughly the variation of your work, right? So if you have enough data to represent the basic variation, then you've got enough data to do your forecasting. So I want to stop talking for a moment, turn it over to you and see if you have any questions. But here's how to keep contact with us. The community seems to be a thing. We haven't even officially launched our community yet, community.55degrees.se, because we're a Swedish company. But we are talking about stuff like this. So if you want to come to a place to talk about this, you don't even have to use any of our tools. We don't have to talk, we can talk about the tools, but we can also talk about the topics behind the tools. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.